afternoon, everyone. I'm Marc Plattner. I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and co-chair of the International Forum for Democratic Studies Research Council. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion of the impact of social media. We've entitled this panel, The Road to Digital Unfreedom, which also served as the heading for a set of articles on this subject that appeared in the January 2019 issue of the Journal of Democracy. This isn't a new area of concern for the journal or for NED's International Forum. In July of 2010, my co-editor at the journal, Larry Diamond, wrote an article for the journal entitled Liberation Technology. And 2 years later, we gathered this essay and a number of others that had subsequently appeared in the journal into a book entitled Liberation Technology, Social Media and the Struggle for Democracy. The first section of this volume focused on liberation versus control in cyberspace. And Larry's essay concluded by saying, quote, "There is now a technological race underway between Democrats seeking to circumvent internet censorship and dictatorships that want to extend and refine it." So we were far from being completely oblivious to the potential dangers ahead. Still, the 2012 book and its emphasis on the liberationist potential of social media today sounds not only a bit Pollyannish, but also a little archaic, given that the democracies don't seem to be faring very well in this technological race. No one, however, could accuse the set of articles in the latest issue of the journal of being excessively optimistic. To use Ron Deibert's expression, they call upon us to face squarely some painful truths, not only the fact that authoritarian regimes have been harnessing the internet to serve dictatorship, but also the pathologies that social media have introduced into democratic societies. In addition to Ron Deibert's essay, the current set of articles includes a powerful piece on developments in Xi Jinping's China by Xiao, who's also on our panel, a piece on artificial intelligence by Stephen Feldstein, and a short but no less gloomy introductory essay by Larry Diamond. And also on our panel today, along with Ron Deibert and Xiao, are Chris Walker, NED's Vice President for Studies and Analysis, and Shanthi Kalathil, our Senior Director for the International Forum. And both Chris and Shanthi have been taking the lead on the very extensive work that the International Forum has been doing on the general subject of the information space and the new dangers that it confronts. So I will very shortly give the floor to Chris, who will chair today's discussion. But first, I need to make the requisite bows to social media. So those of you who are on Twitter can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDemocracy, or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NEDemocracy. And if you have not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marc. And it's emblematic of the world we live in that you made the last comment there. And I'm just going to take the opportunity before we get started to acknowledge Marc and Larry, both for the work they've done on this issue, the issue in January specifically, which I think is an important one, but really for the success of the Journal of Democracy more generally. As Marc indicated, this is something I think we've increasingly seen as an issue that's so deeply intertwined with the health of democracy, both in advanced democracies, something I think few really anticipated, but of course the changing landscape in other polities that have less space and are more closed societies, the way in which this technology perhaps has come with more wrinkles than were anticipated, say, looking back from 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm hard-pressed to think of better people to discuss this than the ones we have with us. I'm not going to read their entire bios. Marc already alluded to them. I'll just give you their affiliations very briefly before we get into the discussion. So to my right is Ron Deibert, as Marc mentioned. He's a professor of political science and director of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. To my left is Qiang. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of China Digital Times and an adjunct professor at the School of Information and the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. And to my far left is my colleague Shanthi Kalathil, who's the senior director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies and has really been looking at these issues, I would argue, far before many people in terms of understanding the potential trajectory, one that was not as benign as so many observers believe going back 10 or 20 years ago. We'll do this conversation style, so there won't be any formal presentations. Each of the speakers will start at the outset emphasizing some of the points they think are most important. We'll have a discussion. We'll then integrate questions from the audience. So I'd like to start with Ron. As Marc alluded to, your article is quite grim in many respects, pointing out what you describe as three painful truths. Maybe you could just explain what the key aspects of this is and the essence of your article so we can get the ball rolling.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. Actually, the article has its genesis at a meeting of the World Movement for Democracy where I gave remarks on a panel about social media, and afterwards Larry and Marc asked if I'd consider putting the remarks in essay form, and I was glad to do it because these were ideas that had been germinating, floating around for a while, and I felt in many ways the article was not presenting anything novel. It was simply synthesizing what are now becoming widely held views, in fact kind of a conventional wisdom out there. So I called them three painful truths, and the first is that what we call social media is actually better described more accurately as personal data surveillance. The economic model of social media is a very simple transaction, as you all know, I'm sure. In exchange for free services, you allow the companies to monitor everything that you do in order that they can target you with advertisements. That's the revenue generating model of social media. Of course, the companies don't describe themselves that way. They portray what they do in more anodyne terms. So Facebook says it's about building a community. They don't talk about their customers. And there's a certain logic to personal data surveillance or surveillance capitalism that's relentless. So we have this almost unstoppable momentum behind building more and more sensor points on more and more devices with the Internet of Things and so on. Basically, our entire lives are now part of this giant ecosystem of surveillance capitalism. So even though certain platforms may come and go, at the heart of it is a pretty fundamental mode of production that I think is hard to escape, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. The second painful truth, if you will, is that we like it. We consent to it, but not necessarily wittingly. And that's the key point. I think everyone, I can see in the room, people have devices with them. I use them for convenience purposes. It's almost impossible to escape the architecture of social media around us. But further than that, I think there are many ways in which we don't really understand what it is that we're signing up for. So first of all, in most basic sense, if you look at any particular social media application you use, they all come with the terms of service. Very few people actually read the terms of service. Even if you did read the terms of service, you'd need a legal degree to understand it. So we're entering into a strange situation here where we're having contractual relationships with dozens of companies that, and we're agreeing to give them permission to do things without being fully aware of it. But more fundamentally, when I say that we don't wittingly consent to it, is a basic fact about how social media operates. These are addiction machines. Basically, every social media platform is designed in such a way to draw upon your emotions, to bring you in close contact and dependent on the application, because of course the business model is about monitoring as much of everything you do as possible. In order for them to succeed at that, they need you to use the application. So this part, I think we're beginning to only grasp in terms of how much resources and effort are put in by these companies into behavioral modification and operant conditioning techniques. But when you look around and you kind of reflect on it, it's pretty obvious. Like little bells going off in our pockets and vibrations and things designed to draw us in. I mean, this is like basic Skinnerian psychology. The problem, of course, is that this has some pretty malicious effects. And the last of the painful truths is that social media not only is compatible with authoritarianism, I believe it is actually propelling authoritarian practices. And by that I mean that the type of discourse that by design is propagated through social media actually undermines the conditions, the ideal conditions, if you will, for the public sphere. So in order to grab people's attention, the algorithms by design push extreme, prejudiced, biased content that's spectacular to the surface, and that's in order to draw people in, of course. But this works at a systemic level to the disadvantage of all of the things, all of the characteristics that we need to have a healthy, liberal, democratic public sphere. Investigative journalism is disadvantaged. There's so much a flood of information out there that you can't discern fact from fiction easily. And even if you do, by the time you discern it and try to correct people, new falsehoods are raining down constantly. So we've created a kind of a machine that is undermining democratic society. And when you add it all up, I think it's pretty profoundly concerning. And also, the last thing I'll say is hard to imagine how we begin unraveling it all, but yet we must.
And so I'm going to take your final painful truth and use it as a bridge to Xiao. And I think everything that Ron just set forth is quite daunting. Much of Ron's article looks at these issues in a general sense, looking at how these technologies have largely emerged from the west coast of the United States and now are being diffused and adopted elsewhere and adapted elsewhere. You looked at this in the context of China, which has an enormous market, enormous resources, and an authoritarian government that's very purposeful with the direction it's taking the technology. So perhaps you could give the key elements of your article and give us a sense of how this is playing out in the China context.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Ron, to give your insightful remarks on the technology and surveillance and the relationship with authoritarianism in general. Let's all start from even 30 years ago that students start to, or almost starting to, getting on the street in Beijing, in China. While I was studying here, I already came to the United States 2.5 years, following what's happening. And then there is June 4th, the massacre, the fall of the goddess of democracy in the blood. The Chinese people's dream for freedom, for democracy, was crushed by tanks. Personally, I became a human rights activist ever since, from a student in astrophysics. Fast forward a few more years, 1994, internet came to China. 1994. From then on, among many people, among even the generation of people who were on square, on the street, that felt the dream for democracy being crushed, saw the new hope. I'm not even exaggerating. some of my fellow student activists who organized demonstrations here in Washington, D.C., came back to China, become an internet company, first early ones providing China's early infrastructures. Yes, they work with the state, but they also harbored, even secretly, among themselves, feel this is a transformative force for China to be freer, to be better. From that angle or perspective, I too shared the digital promise for freedom, empowering the people, the providing the capacity for a new form of collective actions, and no authoritarian regime, including China, can last long in the age of information. And that led me later on in the early 2000s to UC Berkeley, and starting from journalism school and then to the School of Information, focusing solely my effort in the information space, looking at China, and founded China Digital Times. And I engaged or watched and witnessed the growing desire for freedom and a voice from public opinion for democracy in Chinese social media space, from the blog sphere to microblog sphere, from Weibo to some degree to WeChat. Until 2012, if I call this entire process, despite the censorship, despite the crackdown, despite the everything, I called this is the era of new hope for democracy among the Chinese people. The reason I did all of this, because I heard them. I was with them in the same cyberspace every day. Not only just political prisoners, human rights activists, but ordinary people all across the society. And then, I hate to use this Star Wars or the trilogy again. Xi Jinping stepped in the office, the Empire Strike Back. Big time. Crackdown on cyberspace, using every means you can think of, arresting people, put the public opinion leaders on the TV, mobilize millions of 50 Cent's army or the online commentators, called disinformation, you can call them forces, new technology, new police, new sources, everything to contain and put this Jenny back to the bottle that controls the society in the past 5-6 years and continues. Even in this environment, even on the surface, the Chinese dictatorship conquered or took back the control of the cyberspace. But beneath of that, I still do believe the Chinese people that once they sense the freedom and they had certain value changed in their heart, it's hard to change back. You don't just engineer people's souls just like Mao's time or Stalin's time. That kind of totalitarian regime is the past. Yeah, you can arrest people, you can intimidate people, but you can't really put millions of people in the concentration camp. Well, wait a minute, it actually can. They're doing it right now in Xinjiang. So I still had that hope. So I'm waiting for the Star Wars third trilogy, the third episode coming back, right? The Jedi will return, and freedom will prevail. But the third trilogy episode, unfortunately, is a new title called "The Emperor Got AI." We've got big data and AI. This is big. This is bigger than anything I can anticipate it as an activist who had all the hope for China. Not saying I'm losing all the hope, okay? But I'm saying this is a new turn of technology, of Internet of Things, of a big data analysis, of cloud computing, of the artificial intelligence, as Ron already described. It's already worked for companies, corporations to monetize that, to target advertising people, to influence people's behavior. But with a fusion of that technology, that power of that new technology, actually the technology of that new power, in the hand of a Chinese dictator, of China's dream, the fusion of that is big. Now it's not just an economic project, making money out of the consumers, of citizens, in the expense of our privacy. Now it's a political project. And the political project to maintain a Chinese authoritarian regime, a dictatorship, is not even stopped within the Chinese border. And it's totalizing. That's another thing. People have nowhere to hide now if you're using your smartphone on the WeChat or anything in China. And the people are embracing it. So this is the essay I'm describing all these aspects: social credit system, facial recognition, voice recognition, DNA collection, and artificial intelligence, etc. I can go on and on all those lists. I engage in the Chinese cyberspace, read those things, watch the government sort of talks and conversations and their papers and their ideas. And at this point, they are not even hiding their ambition. And things are not in the far future. Some of them are happening right now. And Xinjiang is the best example of it. And I have my other life that in the Berkeley sort of School of Information, I'm surrounded on the campus and near Silicon Valley by the discussion and new ideas, excitement and worries and deep concerns about this new technology and potential, that turning data, our behavior data beyond ourselves into some kind of knowledge, but not owned by us, by citizens, by consumers, but by them, whether the corporation or the state directly, and using that against us in the disguise of providing support system and convenience and high quality of life and dash digital fashion, etc. But actually, deeply, we are going through the crisis of freedom and dignity altogether. And this happening in China in a big time because you already read it. I listed on that. I'm just concluded like that. Just summarize it like this. This is a dream technology for a dictator, and they're embracing it. And they are the dream, the suppressed dream of Chinese people for freedom, by tanks, by machine guns, by prisons, by exiled people, by internet censors, and now also by this entire digital apparatus from Baidu to Tencent to Alibaba to including Google, Facebook, etc. If they go to China, same thing. Even the word Apple for Microsoft, that providing services, improving life qualities, and modernize the Chinese economy, making China stronger. But individual freedom and autonomy is diminishing in the fastest speed that we ever know. And that's happening in China. And it has impact all over the world.
So you've sketched out a pretty daunting environment. And between you and Ron, it looks kind of grim. Shanthi, you've had this unusual perch of looking both at China's tech environment and more broadly global developments. I'm wondering how you see the sort of scenarios that both Ron and Xiao have sketched out and what you would say in response to this.
Well, if you're looking for me to provide the optimistic view, I'll have to reach for that. But first, thanks so much, and it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with such a great group and people who have been thinking about this for so long. For my part, I've tried to think through, I've read both articles, and I've tried to distill some common threads and maybe to repackage them and synthesize them in a way. And they resonate a bit with some observations that I've made, about the global environment. And so since we seem to be in a theme of threes, I'll present three myths. Okay, so the first is that this is a conversation primarily about the online world, not the offline world. I think we're used to thinking about technology as something that we interact with through a phone. Maybe if we're older, we think about sitting in front of a computer screen and typing. But I think that this frame, if we're really to truly grapple with some of the trends we've been talking about, we have to get away from this frame. Technology now permeates and suffuses all aspects of our everyday life. And I don't just mean in the advanced democracies. I think increasingly this is something that is happening all over the world. And you can see this in a number of dimensions, but if we're thinking about the ways, for instance, in which Xiao has mentioned AI, the application of artificial intelligence to repression, this is something that civil society activists all over the world will have to grapple with, whether or not they do anything that has to do with technology. If this is something that enhances the capabilities of authoritarianism, if it enhances the abilities of authoritarian governments to stay one step ahead of activists, to predict where there might be trouble or protests, to engage in predictive policing and pull people off the streets before anything happens, then this is something that is of concern to activists whether or not they believe that they have some kind of interaction with technology. I'd also mention briefly here the evolving nature of the Internet of Things, which essentially refers to computer-equipped, sensing-equipped everyday devices, whether it's ordinary industrial goods. Really, it can be applied to just about anything. And so if we think about that as a technology issue, we're sort of missing the point. This is really something that we're going to have to think about as we interact with all these objects in our everyday lives. And they, in turn, transmit our data to central nodes, which can then potentially be used by governments or other bad actors. The second myth is that I think, the name of this cluster is The Road to Digital Unfreedom, and it tends to conjure up, and maybe explicitly so, a sort of Orwellian vision of the future. And that's not to argue that the Orwell metaphor is not accurate, and I think in some of the things that Xiao in particular has described, that would be quite apt, particularly in Xinjiang, for instance. But what Ron has described is actually the flip side of that. It's the Huxley version of this dystopia. It's the version in which we not only need this technology, but we depend on it for convenience and we depend on it for entertainment. In fact, we depend on it for all the everyday facets of our lives, and so it makes it impossible to completely extricate ourselves from that world. And so where you could conjure up an Orwellian vision that people would inherently fight against, because there is that innate desire to fight against that Orwellian vision, it's a little harder to fight against the Huxley vision, to fight against a vision where everything is provided to you and everything is made easy. But you have to pay a cost, and that cost is often not explicitly made to the consumers and to people who are engaging with technology. And the third myth, I think, is that a lot of these trends around digital repression and so on can be attributable to, let's say, backdoor surveillance, the kind of underhanded surveillance techniques that firms and governments around the world engage in to perhaps hack into networks, to insert backdoors into technology or telecommunications products. And this is not to argue that this doesn't happen, obviously. But I think we need to be equally concerned about the front door through which a lot of these bad things can come in. And by that I mean, again, as Ron alluded to, the terms of service that consumers sign up to every time that they buy a product. Or perhaps when you buy your washing machine, you don't know that you're signing terms of service, that your washing machine is going to send information about you to some central server, but you do agree to that, implicitly or explicitly. And I think this is something that we are not quite equipped to handle yet. Again, because if I go back to my first point, we don't think of these interactions as interacting with technology, and yet increasingly we have to be cognizant of the risks that this front door is presenting in these situations. So those are sort of the three main myths that I would highlight here. And I would just conclude by saying, and because I can never resist a good movie metaphor, and not to say that your third movie title, The Emperor Gets AI, is not compelling, but I don't know that everybody would go watch that. I think they want something that is going to be a little more inspiring, and it led me to think of the name of the actual trilogy last movie, which is The Return of the Jedi. And I was thinking through, well, who are the Jedi in this scenario? And who are we trying to get to come and get us out of this mess? And I think we actually, as civil society people, as governments, as businesses, we really need to grapple with who is going to take that on in the coming era.
So maybe building on some of Shanti's observations, Ron, there's been a school of thought, at least until recently, that the new technology, the digital age, is simply the latest version of what we've experienced over history, whether it's the printing press, radio, or television, and we'll figure it out. And it's not something that's different in kind or qualitatively different. But listening to this conversation, it sounds like it really is. Maybe you just give your reflections on why it is, if you agree with that, or if you think it's simply another iteration of something we've grappled with and kind of sorted out. Take it in that direction.
Well, I think that certainly there are some useful historical analogies that you could go back to, and of course throughout human history we've experienced quite sudden shifts, relatively speaking, although nowhere near as fast as this one, in modes of communication. So the invention of the printing press, in fact, if you go back and look at some of the discussion around then, it would seem quite familiar. People were talking about information overload and how this would degrade public discourse in ways that are similar. I do think what we're dealing with now, because of the pace and the volume, is qualitatively different than what's come before. Certainly you can't say there's been anything anywhere near close to the type of fine-grained surveillance that's going on that's connected to this technology that we consent to and participate in. We live in a culture of kind of auto-surveillance. You know, these are my children, here is my place of work, this is what I'm eating, right? So and that's part of the culture of it, is to encourage that type of behavior. I wanted to actually say a couple of things in response. Got me thinking, listening to both the other comments. So when you think about social media and the platforms that we all recognize, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and the Chinese companies, it's important to remember that there are several layers of other companies that orbit those ones that we all recognize. Many of them come from the security sector, the security industry. And they're providing a kind of value-added service on top of the social media. So they're like companies that harvest and analyze data for law enforcement, for intelligence, for military. That sector, I think, is especially problematic for the topic that we're discussing here, because as we've shown at Citizen Lab, the players in this industry are poorly regulated, generally speaking, and highly prone to abuse. And so what we're seeing is powerful technologies being put in the hands of unprincipled policymakers who are using them under what sounds like legitimate purposes, so fighting crime or terrorism or cybersecurity, when in fact what they're doing is actually effectively monitoring political opposition groups and neutralizing them. The flip side of this is also quite disturbing to me, is that, you know, there are many positive uses of social media that we all recognize by civil society, people mobilizing and doing all sorts of things that we want to encourage. But I think now we're beginning to realize that it's also become a bit of a Achilles heel. So social media, of course, is about connecting people and sharing information and embedding your interaction with the technologies that allow this right down into your pocket. So whereas in the past, if a autocratic regime wanted to silence a dissident, they maybe would have a difficult time if that dissident was in another country. They'd have to send spies or agents to track them down, monitor their house and so on. Now, thanks to some of these cybersecurity companies, they can literally get inside not only their pockets and devices, but in some cases, I'm not exaggerating here, their minds, because they're seeing everything that's going on within that person's life, all of their social relationships, all of their contacts, all of their plans. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that I believe is causing enormous havoc worldwide, and it is very much connected to the technologies, the digital environment that we live in.
And so one thing you're suggesting is that innovation in and of itself won't necessarily get us out of this. I've heard that as a proposal in the face of some of these tough issues that we've been discussing, but it's really about the norms that guide the use of these technologies. So maybe you just say a word on that, and then I'd like to get both Shanthi and Xiao to share their observations.
Well, I think that here we could borrow some analogies from regulation and control of other things that have caused harm, like the trade in conventional arms, for example, or other technologies. We need to start thinking about the application of those strategies to this particular area. This sector, as it stands right now, is largely operating without any consequences for bad behavior. So you have companies going out and essentially enabling some pretty terrible things that have lethal consequences. The only way to prevent that from happening, or one way to prevent that from happening, is by regulating that industry. And governments need to be mobilized in some manner to take action against it. I think that will take time. It's certainly something that I'm and others are working on in the hope that we can restrain some of the abuses that are going on.
And I'll turn to the audience soon and start integrating questions if you have them, if you want to start thinking about them. Before I do that, let me first go to Shanthi, if you want to just give your thoughts on what sorts of norms we might start thinking about, or what some sort of process would be useful given our experience and given the experience with other digital initiatives in this realm over the past, say, 2 decades or so.
I think that there are 2 ways to think about it. One is to think of initiatives in the digital realm, and the other is to think, as Ron has suggested, at some of these really intractable problems that we have faced throughout the course of our modern times, and which we have also devised solutions to. And I actually, if you want me to try to think in a positive manner and to not be the doom and gloom voice here, I think it's actually quite it inspires hope to see how many really complex challenges that we collectively have managed to deal with. And you can point to any number of things throughout history, but simply sort of working in a safe environment, for instance. So I think we could learn in this space both from understanding what's worked in those past cases, as well as understanding sort of the broad layer of both incentives and disincentives in this space of technology. So what would serve to incentivize companies, for instance, to act more in line with democratic norms than not? And I think that's a combination of factors, that it implies that there would be some kind of attention paid to these issues, that journalism and media would have a role to highlight and showing some of the abuses. And Ron, obviously, you've been at the sharp end of this recently. But beyond that, that there would be some kind of concerted effort to not just push for change on a policy front, but to enable a whole structure of non-governmental responses around that. Because I don't think this is something that can be addressed solely through regulation or policy, even though there have been some promising steps in that direction. I think to really, because a lot of these issues, the reason why it's so hard to get traction in the digital space is because they involve very thorny issues of speech and privacy. Some of the most thorny and difficult issues to wrestle with in a democratic sort of context. So the only way to really get at that is to empower civil society to be a real part of finding that solution. And to me, I think that, to my mind, it goes beyond simply highlighting issues and raising attention and so on. It really has to be through thinking creatively about solutions. And I think you can point to any number of initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives that have to do with internet freedom, stopping internet shutdowns, and so on, but to take them a little bit into a broader space, maybe the space Ron's alluding to in other places, and just to try it out and see what works.
And so this is largely a discussion about what might be done in open settings where you have institutions that could challenge and raise these issues, hopefully get some traction so you have better public policy and societal responses. But the environment in China where the digital surveillance censorship regime is gathering pace and force, there really aren't many checks on that at the moment. So how should we think about the way in which the world responds to the challenge presented by China's ambitions?
Well, let me just share some of my observations on concrete examples. And I like Shanthi was saying that, pointing out the myth of using Orwellian 1984 as a metaphor, and then use the Brave New World as another one. Actually, none of them, even combination of both of them, is adequate in terms of my observation of China. They're all missing even something. So don't take those last century's dystopian vision simply apply to what's happening coming at us, all of us, but looking at China. The reason is, for one thing, right, the power of the technology and the kind of service they provide, and kind of a function they function in the society. It's not just bad evil. Yeah. They fit people's needs, right, and they fit. They provide some kind of services and that society needs. Let me give you two examples, but they suppress the freedom big time. When Weibo was a micro blogging service, even under the censorship, it's under the spread out throughout China 2011, starting from 2009, but all the way to 2011, 2012. Because the vast of the internet users are more and more outspoken, so the public opinion clearly towards more liberal democratic ideological sort of base or value. Then WeChat came in. At the beginning, because of lack of regulations, even more freer information goes around. But pretty soon that's being changed. Of course, Weibo is also under the severe crackdown now. But the one thing happened in WeChat I observed very distinctly is the more people using WeChat for other additional services, such as online payment, such as booking a taxi, such as booking a hotel, everything within that one so convenient app, the less the bold speech there are. Because it's, among many other things, it's not a police knock your door, arrest you, that's too much effort. But to stop your account for a month or even a week, it costs you tremendous of inconvenience in your life, and people watch themselves, refrain themselves to doing it. The more they rely on it, the more they self-realize that they don't want to cause interruption for that kind of business and social life convenience and advantage. The second thing I want to say is that, so you see the public opinion, among other things in the crackdown, anything decreasing. And then the more concrete to home example, like right now, I just came back from UC Berkeley last week. I saw the Telegraph Avenue, there's a new store, a Chinese store. Of course, marketing to the Chinese, growing Chinese the student population on campus, which is not that much, many, for solely, not Chinese restaurant, solely for Chinese snacks. Okay? These young people like snacks. Paid by WeChat, Alipay. You don't need to do anything. You came from China, carry your cell phone, walk in the store, walk out with your favorite snacks. Okay? These are the same Chinese students that are educated in UC Berkeley, come to my lectures. These are the same Chinese students told me they like China GeoTimes, Chinese version and English version, and hate censorship. They have no problem to use their WeChat to buy things at all. They love it. They tell me how great it is. They say, pity you cannot go back to China. Look like this is how advanced and you know, so sorry you're in exile. You can do it. Cannot do it. If I say this is something wrong, well, Google and Facebook can do it too. Well, yes, but there's also no different than there's no privacy, you know, barrier that the state can come in. But just they have no awareness of that. Even if you tell them that, they still feel like, oh, that's fine. No, this is a great thing that make us proud as a Chinese. It concerns me, yeah. And this lack of a resistance, a lack of real understanding of what the kind of the digital apparatus behind that, how powerful that is to me a real threat. Yeah.
So I'll take questions if anybody wants to get my attention, but in the meantime, if there aren't any, it just strikes me that based on what Ron has described and Xiao, your observation on what is really the enormous convenience of this technology among the other attractions, that there needs to be some effort to reframe this so that wider audiences understand this underlying digital architecture and what it implies. To the extent this remains sharing and convenience, it'll be very hard to get traction, I suspect. So I just wonder, kind of off the cuff, if someone were to ask you what, apart from the very compelling Three Painful Truths, that one you've already kind of copyrighted, but if you had to give other observations on or suggestions on what might help reframe this in a way that wouldn't lock it into kind of sharing, convenience, and so forth, which is the more benign and fine in a way, because it is convenient and there is a lot of sharing, but it doesn't allow you to get to the very real issues that you've been describing.
That's a good question, and that's the challenge I think that everyone is grappling with now. And I'm part of a community of people who are wrestling with these issues and spend a lot of time on various email lists, in discussion with others who are thinking about, everyone is having a difficult time coming up with, well, what is the solution here? If what I present in that article is accurate, has some truth to it, then we've got a pretty steep challenge here, because we're talking about reforming a whole way of life that we're highly dependent on and even maybe addicted to. So the thing that I think we need to emphasize, among others, is that we can have all of the beneficial components of digital technology without some of these downsides. So there was an internet before there was social media. You could have a different business model than the one that currently exists. So you could have the convenience and the sharing, and in fact I think it's essential for us as a species to communicate globally. We don't want to turn the clock back on that, but we maybe want to think of alternatives to personal data surveillance capitalism that's at the heart of it. That is a steep challenge in and of itself, because frankly, not being an engineer, I can't imagine what that would be like to architect. But I think there are a lot of smart people in the world who are beginning to think about this, and eventually that might be one potential solution. It's not the only one, but it's one avenue.
Any other thoughts on this point?
Well, I typically don't focus on government regulation, but I know there have been recent initiatives that have tried to just bite off pieces of it. So, for instance, on the Internet of Things security aspect, in the U.S. there have been bipartisan bills introduced in Congress that seek solely to address government IT procurement, and for that particular aspect to mandate a certain compliance with standards laid out by the Commerce Department, for instance. And the hope is that by setting certain standards in that department, it would then trickle down to the consumer side. So that's one way of getting at it, a very top-down way of getting at it. The bottom-up piece, the consumer education piece, is so difficult, as you've said, and I really think until people really understand and grapple with the fact that all of the convenience is not free, that, I know this is something of a truism now, and we all say it, but I don't know that we really get it. The fact that we are not the customers of these companies, we are the product. And until that's really made apparent from the bottom-up perspective, from the consumer perspective, you need to have those things meet in the middle, because no amount of top-down regulatory action is going to fix the consumer education piece of things.
Xiao?
I have three probably not coherent points. The first one is that just look at China's internet market and how strong the few Chinese top internet companies are going, technically, financially, and globally. The conventional wisdom of, a authoritarian society, they don't have freedom of expression, their lack of innovation, they can only copycat, therefore, they're not that, they're behind of innovative, let's say, Silicon Valley and free world. Not quite true on this case. That looking at how innovative and effective some of those Chinese companies on the technologies competitive they are, I think that partially because of the large size of the Chinese market, that conventional wisdom doesn't apply in China. And the quality of the service they're coming out, etc. The second point I want to say is that yes, there are some resistance. Take an example of social credit system. when it was a pilot project, still a pilot project, but early pilot projects back to 2012, 2014 even, Xi Jinping already in power, there was some momentary space of a lot of Chinese media, official media included, People's Daily included, had critiques on those pilots, precisely because of the power behind them, and basically not too much for citizen freedom, citizenry, the number of things that not far from what today we're criticizing that system at all, but it's generated within China by people's instinct that this works for the government, not works for the people, etc. But that discussion or critiques, public critiques, pretty soon, last about a year, are being suppressed and then being stopped. So it's no more that kind of discussion in the public space. So again, that's a freedom expression issue. If there are, it's not that Chinese people cannot capable of come up to say this thing that actually working against us in many ways. Third thing is that there are possible disadvantage, let's say, that those, even the Chinese companies and Chinese state are empowering this sector of more surveillance and better surveillance and using the advantage of can collect a lot cheaper data that the other free society with democratic society with privacy laws and this cannot get it easily to advance a competitive advantage. But there are also plenty of room to say on privacy level that the companies outside of China that can put that as a competitive advantage to put, or distrust, like Huawei, distrust of those companies from the authoritarian state to put them at least not so competitive around the world, say the least. Yeah. So there are things we must do and should do to resist this digital, what I call the trend towards digital totalitarianism.
So as we work towards conclusion, it strikes me that your articles, Ron, Xiao, respectively, they really sketch out two big problems among a whole set of related problems. One is open societies that have independent institutions and the capacity for meaningful reform and change to sort this out in a way that works and is healthy for democracy. The other part of the equation is what Xiao has sketched out, which is how China first and foremost, but a host of other authoritarian regimes, marshaling the technology, refining it, and then putting it towards their own purpose, which is essentially to limit dissent and control the political environment. These are distinct, but I would say in some ways related, not least because China's ambitions, as we see with their diffusion of the technologies and the sharing, as it were, beyond their borders to other parts of the world, presents another wrinkle to this story that I think few really anticipated going back 20 or 25 years ago. So if we were to break this down more practically as a way of getting at the challenges, because these are very big challenges, taken in the aggregate that can almost seem overwhelming, what would you suggest, say, starting with the open societies and the problems that have emerged, based on some assumptions that haven't played out, based on some problems that have become clearer with time? I think, this is just maybe the nature of things in some ways. Now that we have a better sense of this, what would you say if someone asked you what we really need to prioritize in terms of getting the societies on better footing?
I think it's there's a spectrum of tactics that we need to employ and strategies to adopt. So there's not one single solution to these interconnected problems that we're identifying. I think clearly there's a role for government regulation, but that's not the end of it. I think starting with agencies that protect consumers and have privacy among other values at the core of what they do, and being equipped and empowered with real teeth to punish companies that act not in the public interest would be a good step forward when it comes to what governments can be doing. I think we also need the education component, which Shanthi talked about, is making sure that we get young people to think differently about their relationship to information and data, and start generationally acculturating people into a different philosophy when it comes to how they think about giving away all of this about themselves in exchange for being targeted with advertisements. So it's kind of like a investment in civic culture that is sorely missing, not just in this area, but across societies in general. I think we've seen a decline in that area. I also think we need more vigorous adversarial research of the sort that Citizen Lab does. So there could be many more organizations doing what we do. There are a few, and I'd like to see more of that. I think it's exceptionally important in light of the fact that we depend so much on these technologies. We need there to be groups that will tear it all apart and look at what's going on beneath the surface. To give you one example, we did a study of WeChat, and we did a systematic experiment to discover that when you send messages, they simply wouldn't appear on the recipient's mobile device. They'd be silently removed without any notification. That set of experiments that allowed us to make that determination was pretty laborious, but it revealed something interesting. I don't know if that will impact users in China, who, as you rightly describe, are in love with WeChat, find it very convenient. But perhaps if more of that was done, people would start going, oh, wait a minute, that's kind of creepy. I don't think that should be going on, or at least I should be notified about it. So that type of, opening up the black box right down to the level of algorithms needs to be encouraged across society. And that really has to happen at universities or in the nonprofit sector, funded by foundations, would be where I would start.
Mm-hmm. And Xiao, you've described how formidable the kind of system that's been imposed upon the Chinese public. I don't know if you can impose something with a degree of willingness in the sense that, but it's this strange mix of an approach that gets the convenience used in a way that also enables control. What should we be doing from the outside with respect to the surveillance censorship regime that's emerged, with all the limitations that seem to be there? I think the Xinjiang horror has really elevated this discussion, not just for the fact that so many people are being put into camps, but the surveillance component to this, and that's played a role in that. But beyond that, what do you think could be done to play a more meaningful role in explaining to publics outside China what the situation there is?
I really want everyone look into the Xinjiang situation even deeper. I know it's all over the press. I know even now the UN Commission right now is going on, the Human Rights Commission is talking about it. I know it's being reported all over the place. But first of all, it's not happening just in Xinjiang. Let's say there's a project called 雪亮工程, Sharper Eyes, which basically puts surveillance cameras in every corner of China. Not just city, not just public spaces, every village, everywhere by 2020, coming up, at least on the agenda. It's going on right now, Sharper Eyes, just search. And there's a list of the top, let's say 80 projects, the largest contracts of Sharper Eyes, putting the surveillance equipment and the data transmission and the algorithm behind it that the company contracted, and some companies are on the stock market, that top 80, 2018, 2017, 2019 hasn't come yet. 1/3 of them in Xinjiang, another 2/3 of them all over the place in China. right? It's expanding. It's fusing to other places. So it is sort of diffusing throughout the Chinese society. Secondly, so what can we do from our side? First of all, it's really, to me, I'm actually very late. I think I'm a late awakening to this new kind of a power. It's not about putting people in prison. It's not about changing people's propaganda, changing their values, or it's not about, those continues in China at least. But this is about other things too, that not more than convenience, like social credit system, that the people loves it, they're giving them incentives, they provide them a structure of life, that they love it. They nudge people's, organize people's behavior to the needs of the ruling people, the corporations, for monetized reasons, and for the political elites for controlling reasons. And that kind of a power they have is new and huge, more than giving the directions of technology goes and society goes. So to wakening up to that kind of threat to freedom in general, and then to somehow calling us not drop out of technology, not that individually that doesn't work. It's not an individual response. It's a collective response all over the place, at state level, at the civil society level, at global level. It's this new collective response we must have within this society, and also as Ron introduced. It's not just what I look at China, but it's also you cannot cut that off without looking at the surveillance capitalism doing all over the world, particularly in this country. And so that is the issue that we are facing. It's not even one particular country is particularly worse than we focus on that. It's a globally dealt with issue. And that's why I think this forum is so much needed today. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Xiao. And so Shanthi, I'll give you the last word. To the extent these roots have already grown rather deep in some problematic ways, what do you feel we should be emphasizing at this point?
I mean, I would largely agree with many of the points that Ron and Xiao made already. I guess just to put a slightly different spin on things or to address a different angle, I do think we have to keep our eye on how authoritarian governments in particular are seeking to subvert the very norms that we're trying to protect. And they're doing so in various institutions and international arenas. So for instance, through internet governance, authoritarian governments are trying to redefine what it means to have cybersecurity, for instance. And cybersecurity, according to their definition, means patrolling dissidents and rounding up dissidents. We can't take our eye off that ball because it's at that level of norms and institutions that really set a precedent for behavior and norms all throughout the world. And unfortunately, as democracies have sort of not been so assertive on that front, I think authoritarian governments have been very assertive there, not just in definitions, but also trying to assert presence around defining standards for technology, to work in any number of different ways, and including, subverting the notion of what privacy is, whether privacy should include provisions for restrictions against unfettered government access to personal information, for instance. New privacy laws, or not laws, but some new privacy legislation regulations that are just out in China are quite extensive, and they've been compared favorably in Western press to GDPR, for instance. And yet they have huge loopholes for government access to personal information. And yet I feel as though if the Chinese government and other authoritarian governments are able to achieve a sheen of respectability on these issues and to define these issues in a way that works for them, it will make the job of protecting those actual values even tougher. And so I think at the very least democracies really need to up their game in all of these fronts, not just on the consumer education front, but to really understand the structural efforts that are being put in place and to actively combat that.
So Shanthi has introduced a subject that in its own right could be the basis of a whole nother panel discussion, but we'll save that for next time. I'm going to take the opportunity now to thank everyone here for participating and really express my thanks to Ron Deibert, Qiang, and Shanthi Kalathil for what I thought was an incredibly thoughtful and insightful discussion. So thanks to all of you.
Please.
Thanks, Chris.